Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Radik Tagirov, a name that would eventually become synonymous with a quiet, lingering terror in the heart of Russia. We begin our journey in the city of Kazan, an ancient and beautiful capital resting where the Volga and Kazanka rivers meet. It was the year 2011. Imagine the city as it was then, caught in the fragile gray transition between the end of a long, punishing winter and the first tentative whispers of spring. The air in Kazan during those weeks was heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of melting snow. In the residential districts, rows of apartment blocks known as Khrushchevkas stood like silent sentinels of a bygone era. These buildings, with their 5-story concrete frames and narrow, dimly lit stairwells, held the lives of thousands. Within their walls, the atmosphere was often one of domestic peace. The muffled sound of a television, the whistle of a tea kettle, and the soft shuffling of slippers against worn linoleum floors. It was here, in the Vakhitovsky and surrounding districts, that a predator began to move, unnoticed and unassuming, a shadow blending perfectly into the mundane rhythms of the city. On the 5th of March, 2011, the first ripple of this darkness touched a quiet apartment on Badishin Street. Inside lived Nassima Ishmuratova, a woman of 82 years who had carved out a life of careful routine. Nassima was known to be cautious, the kind of woman who checked the lock twice and rarely opened her door to strangers. But in the days leading up to that fateful morning, her telephone had fallen silent, the line dead and unresponsive. She was waiting for a repairman, someone to restore her connection to the outside world. When the knock finally came, it was polite and professional. To Nassima, it must have sounded like the help she had been expecting. We can imagine the scene through a hazy, soft lens, the sun filtering through thin lace curtains, the smell of old paper and dried lavender in the air. She moved toward the door, her hand perhaps trembling slightly as she turned the heavy brass latch. She saw a man, young and unremarkable, perhaps holding a clipboard or wearing the functional clothing of a utility worker. His voice would have been calm, steady, and reassuring. With a nod of gratitude, she invited the shadow into her home, unaware that the silence of her telephone was about to become the silence of her entire world. The details left behind in that apartment were chilling in their simplicity. Nassima was found on the floor of her home, her life extinguished not by a struggle of loud violence, but by a cold and calculated efficiency. The killer had used a pillow to stifle any sound, a soft, domestic object turned into a tool of finality. He had moved through her rooms with a disturbing lack of urgency, searching for anything of value. 50,000 rubles were missing, a modest sum that represented the life savings of a woman who had lived through decades of history. But more than the money, it was the clinical nature of the act that should have signaled the danger. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, no signs of a panicked intruder. Just the heavy, oppressive stillness of an apartment where the resident had simply stopped being. For the investigators who arrived on Badishin Street, it initially seemed like an isolated tragedy, a robbery gone wrong in a city that, while generally safe, was no stranger to the hardships of the era. They could not yet see the threads connecting this room to the ones that would soon follow. Exactly 1 month later, the shadow appeared again. This time, the victim was an 85-year-old woman living in another part of the city. Again, the apartment was a Khrushchevka. Again, the victim was a woman living alone, someone whose age and isolation made her the perfect target for a man who moved like a ghost. When her relatives found her, the apartment was in a state of soft disarray. It wasn't the chaotic mess of a typical burglary. Instead, it felt as though someone had carefully, methodically searched through the drawers, looking for hidden stashes of cash or jewelry. The items of her life, photographs, letters, small trinkets, had been shifted aside by hands that felt no empathy. The cause of death was once more strangulation, though this time the killer had used whatever was at hand, a belt from a bathrobe, a simple cord. There was a terrifying adaptability to his methods. He didn't carry a weapon because he didn't need one. He used the very items that made a home feel safe and comfortable against the people who lived there. The pattern was there, whispering in the archives of the Kazan Police Department, but it was still too faint to be heard clearly above the noise of daily crime reports. By the time the leaves began to turn gold and brittle in October of 2011, the city of Kazan was unknowingly harboring a monster. On the 26th of October, the shadow knocked on the door of 83-year-old Nadzda Fantova on Natov Street. He used the same ruse, posing as a worker from the housing and communal services. But Nadzda's story would be different. As the man entered her home and the violence began, something shifted. Perhaps he was hurried, or perhaps Nadzda possessed a hidden strength that defied her years. Though she was beaten and strangled until she slipped into the dark waters of unconsciousness, the thread of her life did not snap. When she finally opened her eyes hours later, the apartment was cold and the intruder was gone, but she was alive. She became the first person to truly look into the eyes of the man the press would later call the Volga Maniac. She described him to the police as a man in his late 20s, standing about 5 feet 7 inches tall, wearing a dark jacket and a black knitted hat. It was a generic description, a face that could belong to anyone standing in a bread line or waiting for a bus, but it gave the investigators a shape to hunt, a face for the shadow. As winter returned to Kazan at the end of 2011, the atmosphere in the elderly communities began to change. The once casual habit of opening the door to a utility worker was replaced by a cold, sharp prickle of fear. Behind the reinforced metal doors of the Khrushchevkas, women sat in the amber glow of their lamps, listening to the echoes in the hallways. Every footstep on the stairs, every rattle of the mail slot, felt like a potential threat. The police were now certain that a single man was responsible for the wave of deaths, but they were no closer to catching him. Radik Tagirov, a former locksmith who understood the mechanics of entry and the psychology of trust, had mastered the art of being invisible. He was a predator who thrived on the vulnerability of the forgotten, moving through the city of Kazan like a chill wind that leaves only silence in its wake. The first 9 murders had been committed within the city limits, a concentrated burst of cruelty that was only the beginning. As we close our eyes tonight and think of the Kazan of 2011, we see the city not as a map of streets, but as a collection of glowing windows, each one representing a life that the shadow was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to knock. The stairwells of the apartment blocks in Kazan are often thick with the scent of history. Built during the 1960s, these 5-story structures, known as Khrushchevka, hum with the quiet lives of those who have seen decades of change. In the early months of 2011, a shadow began to move through these concrete corridors, blending perfectly with the gray winter light. He was a man of unremarkable features, dressed in a dark jacket and a black knitted hat that pulled low over his brow. He didn't carry the jagged edge of a knife or the cold weight of a firearm. Instead, he carried a clipboard, or perhaps just a calm, practiced voice. This was his primary tool of intrusion. He would stand before a heavy wooden door, the kind with several locks and a small, glass peephole, and he would wait. He wasn't looking for a struggle. He was looking for a moment of shared humanity, a brief window where a stranger might be welcomed as a helper. He chose the doors of the elderly, those women living alone between the ages of 75 and 90, whose only crime was a lifetime of self-reliance and a lingering trust in the institutions of their youth. His knock was never aggressive. It was the polite, rhythmic tapping of a man doing his job. When a muffled voice asked from behind the wood who was there, he had his answers ready. Sometimes he was a social worker checking on benefits. Other times, he was a technician from the housing department, there to inspect the radiators or the gas pipes before the deep freeze of the Russian winter truly took hold. He spoke with the cadence of bureaucracy, a sound so familiar to the residents of these blocks that it bypassed their instincts of caution. You can imagine the scene through the eyes of one of those women. She unlatches the safety chain, the metal sliding with a soft, silver chink. She opens the door to find a man who looks helpful, perhaps even kind. He steps into the small entryway, the smell of the cold street clinging to his jacket, and the door clicks shut behind him. In that small, cramped space, surrounded by the smell of old books and dried lavender, the transition from guest to predator began with a terrifying, silent shift in energy. Once inside the threshold, he didn't immediately reveal his intent. He would often walk through the apartment, his eyes scanning the rooms for two things: where the money was kept and what household items could be turned into instruments of violence. He was a locksmith by trade, a man who understood how things were put together and, more importantly, how they could be broken. He didn't need to bring a weapon because he knew that every home is filled with them. In the kitchen, there were aprons with long, sturdy ties. In the bathroom, there were the soft, heavy belts of dressing gowns hanging from hooks. On the laundry lines, there were cords of nylon and cotton. To him, these weren't personal belongings of a grandmother. They were tools of efficiency. He once told investigators that he chose strangulation because it was quiet, and in his twisted mind, he believed it was fast. He would wait for the woman to turn her back, perhaps to lead him to a leaky pipe, or to find a document he had requested. And then the mundane world would suddenly turn into a nightmare of restricted breath. The details of his methods are particularly haunting because of how he used the most ordinary objects. In one instance, he found a robe sash and used it as a ligature, but he didn't stop there. He took a common tablespoon from the kitchen and used it as a lever, twisting the fabric tighter and tighter until the air was completely gone. In another home, he reached for the power cord of an electric iron, the plastic casing cold against his hands before the struggle began. He was strong, but his real advantage was the element of surprise and the fragility of his victims. Many of these women had lived through wars and revolutions, only to find the ultimate danger sitting at their kitchen table in the form of a man pretending to care about their welfare. He would hold them until they went still, watching as the life faded from their eyes in the very rooms where they had raised their children and spent their quietest hours. The violence was intimate, personal, and devastatingly quiet, leaving the neighbors in the adjacent apartments completely unaware of the tragedy unfolding just inches away through the thin plaster walls. After the act was done, he did not panic. He was a man of cold, calculated habits. He would move through the apartment, searching for cash, sometimes finding 50,000 rubles, sometimes finding almost nothing at all. But what happened next was perhaps the most chilling part of his process. He knew the police would use dogs to track a scent, so he began to carry cleaning supplies with him. He would take a bottle of household cleaner or a spray from the kitchen and meticulously wipe down the surfaces he had touched. He would even spray the floors to mask his trail, attempting to erase his physical presence from the scene as if he had never been there. He would then step back out into the hallway, adjust his knitted hat, and descend the stairs, passing by other doors where other elderly women sat watching their televisions or drinking tea. He would disappear back into the Kazan snow, leaving behind a silence so profound it would often take days for the truth to be discovered by a visiting relative or a concerned neighbor. This pattern repeated itself across 15 different cities along the Volga River. From 2011 into 2012, he moved like a ghost through Kazan, Samara, Ulyanovsk, and Izhevsk. Each time, the story was the same. A knock, a polite lie, and the use of whatever was at hand to end a life. He claimed he did it for easy money, saying he was unemployed and hungry, yet the precision of his cleanups suggested something more than mere desperation. He left behind a trail of over 31 victims, women who had survived nearly a century only to be targeted for their kindness. The city began to whisper about the man in the dark jacket, the one who looked like a worker but carried the silence of the grave. As the bodies were found, one by one, the community of Kazan realized that the person they were looking for wasn't a monster hiding in the woods, but a man who could be standing right outside their door, clipboard in hand, asking for just a moment of their time. The geography of fear began to stretch, reaching out like the freezing fingers of a Russian winter across the Volga Federal District. What had started as a localized nightmare in Kazan was now a sprawling, multi-city crisis that defied the boundaries of local jurisdiction. As 2011 gave way to the early months of 2012, the shadow of the man they called the Phantom moved with a chilling, rhythmic precision. He was no longer confined to the familiar streets of Tatarstan. He was seen, or rather, the evidence of his presence was found, in the gray, industrial landscapes of Ulyanovsk and the winding avenues of Nizhny Novgorod. Each new crime scene was a mirror of the last. The same quiet entry, the same improvised ligatures, a bathroom robe belt, a cord from an electric iron, or perhaps a simple apron string, and the same devastating silence left in his wake. In the city of Izhevsk, the air grew heavy with a collective holding of breath. In Perm and Samara, the elderly residents began to look at their heavy wooden doors not as portals to the world, but as the only thin line of defense against a predator who wore the face of a helpful stranger. By August of 2012, the toll had reached 18 confirmed lives lost, and the authorities were facing a phantom who seemed to evaporate into the morning mist of the Volga River after every strike. Inside the investigative headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the dry heat of radiators working overtime against the sub-zero temperatures outside. On the walls, a massive map of the Volga and Ural districts had become a tapestry of tragedy. Red-headed pins were scattered across the paper like a slow-moving fever, marking the path of a killer who seemed to have no home, no vehicle, and no digital footprint. Investigators moved through mountains of paper files, their fingers stained with ink as they compared tiny details from over 15 different cities. They were looking for a ghost in a land of millions. The pressure from Moscow was immense, a weight that felt as heavy as the low, leaden clouds hanging over the river. Every time a new body was discovered in a modest, 5-story apartment building, those concrete relics of the Soviet era known as Khrushchevkas, the clock seemed to tick louder. The detectives were working with fragments. They found a sweat-stained scarf in one apartment, a discarded lighter in another. They found a single, solitary shoe print pressed into the crusty, graying snow outside a building in the Ural Mountains. It was a size 40 to 43, a common size for a common man. It was maddeningly anonymous. The killer was not a monster from a fairy tale. He was a man who blended into the crowd at a grocery store, a man who could stand behind you in a bread line and never draw a second glance. Then, in late September of 2012, a breakthrough finally emerged from the digital grain of a security system in the city of Kazan. It was the 26th of the month, a day when the autumn air was turning sharp. The footage was haunting in its mundanity. In the flickering, low-resolution light of an apartment entrance, a man appeared. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, dressed in a dark jacket that looked like 1,000 others sold in the local markets. He carried a stack of papers, tucked neatly under his arm to bolster his disguise as a social worker or a utility representative. The camera caught the side of his face, a jawline, the bridge of a nose, a look of focused calm. For a few heart-stopping seconds, he looked directly toward the lens, his expression unreadable, before he turned and vanished into the stairwell. This was the first time the Phantom had a face. From this grainy window into the past, forensic artists began the painstaking work of creating a composite sketch. They traced the curve of his brow and the set of his mouth, trying to extract a soul from the pixels. When the sketch was released to the public, it was terrifying precisely because of how ordinary it was. He didn't look like a maniac. He looked like a neighbor, a nephew, or a man you might pass on the stairs and offer a polite nod. The image was plastered on every bus stop, every metro entrance, and every television screen from the Volga to the Urals. The release of the sketch triggered a wave of paranoia that swept through the high-rise blocks of central Russia. Every knock on a door became a moment of existential dread for the elderly women living alone. The authorities, desperate to break the silence of the streets, announced a staggering reward. Initially set at 1 million rubles, the price on the Phantom's head would eventually triple to 3 million as the years of failure mounted. It was one of the largest rewards ever offered in the history of Russian criminal justice, a sum meant to tempt even the most loyal associate to turn. But the phones at the tip line remained frustratingly quiet, or worse, they were flooded with thousands of false leads that sent officers chasing shadows in every direction. People reported seeing the man in the sketch in crowded markets, on long-distance trains, and in the quiet corners of rural villages. One theory suggested he had fled to the far eastern islands of Sakhalin. Another posited that he was a local resident of Udmurtia who knew the back alleys of every city he visited. Despite the eyes of a nation watching, the killer seemed to possess an uncanny ability to read the temperature of the pursuit. Just as the dragnet tightened and the reward grew, the murders stopped. The trail went cold, the red pins on the map ceased their march, and the Phantom of the Volga stepped back into the darkness, leaving a trail of 32 grieving families and a mystery that would haunt the Russian heartland for nearly a decade. The heavy, leaden skies of 2012 eventually gave way to a spring that felt surprisingly ordinary. In the wake of the terror that had gripped the Volga region, a strange, suffocating silence began to settle over the high-rise apartments and the winding riverbanks. The frantic headlines that had once screamed of a phantom killer began to migrate from the front pages to the back, and then into the yellowed archives of forgotten news. To the public, it seemed as though the monster had simply dissolved into the gray mist of the Russian landscape. The locks that had been frantically replaced remained turned, but the hand that had rattled them was gone. Years began to stack upon one another like layers of heavy winter snow, each season burying the memory of the victims a little deeper. People stopped looking over their shoulders in the grocery store aisles. The collective breath of the city was slowly, tentatively released. But in the shadows of this newfound peace, the predator had not vanished. He had merely found a new way to exist, trading the frantic energy of the hunt for the dull, rhythmic pulse of a mundane life. In a small, cluttered workshop in the heart of Kazan, the air was always thick with the scent of machine oil and the sharp, metallic tang of shaved brass. This was the world of Radik Tagirov now. Day after day, he sat hunched over a workbench, his fingers, once used for such violent ends, now moving with the delicate precision of a craftsman. The sound of a metal file rasping against a blank key was the only music in his world, a rhythmic scraping that echoed against the cinder-block walls. He was a locksmith, a man whose entire profession was built upon the sanctity of the door. There is a deep, unsettling irony in his choice of trade. The very people who feared him, the elderly and the vulnerable, would call upon him to secure their homes. He would stand in their entryways, smelling of cold air and motor grease, and they would watch his capable hands install the deadbolts that were meant to keep the world away. He would smile, perhaps a small, professional upturn of the lips, and accept their tea and their rubles, all while knowing exactly how easily a person could be erased once those same doors were closed. While Radik worked with the tangible world of iron and steel, a different kind of work was unfolding in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Kazan forensic laboratories. Within those white walls, the case remained a living, breathing entity. In the quiet of the archives, Thousands of tiny plastic sleeves held the only remnants of the killer's presence. There was a single cigarette butt, recovered from a stairwell in 2011, its paper stained and brittle with age. There were fibers from a coat, a single hair caught in a door frame, and the faint, ghostly impressions of a shoe print left in the melting slush of a Kazan winter. These were the molecular ghosts of the Volga Maniac. For years, these samples sat in cold storage, seemingly useless as the technology of the time reached its limits. But the detectives did not stop. They were engaged in a slow, invisible war of attrition, conducting over 10,000 genetic tests across the country. They were looking for a needle in a haystack of 3 million people, waiting for the moment when the biological map of a suspect would finally align with the trail of blood left behind nearly a decade earlier. By 2018, the transformation of Radik Tagirov seemed complete. The man who had once been a vagrant, a thief, and a shadow in the night had become a husband. Imagine the quiet domesticity of his home, the soft hiss of a kettle on the stove, the warmth of a shared blanket on a freezing Tatterstan evening. He had found a woman who saw in him only the hardworking locksmith, a man of few words but steady hands. They built a life together on a foundation of secrets so dark they would have turned the very walls of their apartment to ash. In 2020, as the world outside was paralyzed by a global sickness, Radik's private world reached a pinnacle of normalcy. His son was born. He held the infant in his arms, feeling the fragile beat of a new heart, the very same hands that had once felt the light fade from 31 other souls. He was a father now, a man with a future and a family, a man who believed that the passage of time had successfully laundered his soul. He walked the streets of Kazan not as a predator, but as a parent pushing a stroller, blending perfectly into the tapestry of the city he had once terrorized. But the decade of silence was not a sign of safety. It was merely a long, slow fuse burning toward an inevitable explosion. Every time he brushed his teeth, every time he discarded a piece of trash or touched a surface in a public space, he was leaving behind the very evidence that the investigators were hungry for. The police were no longer looking for a man in a sketch. They were looking for a sequence of proteins. In late 2020, the massive database of the Russian Investigative Committee finally hummed with a match. A relative's DNA, perhaps, or a new sample from a minor infraction, finally bridged the gap between the locksmith in Kazan and the monster of the Volga. The digital search narrowed, circling closer and closer to the apartment where the child slept and the wife cooked. The invisible web was tightening, and Radik, caught in the comfort of his mundane disguise, never felt the strands begin to pull taut. The years of silence were about to be shattered by a sound he had spent a decade trying to forget. The heavy, rhythmic thud of boots in the hallway, and the final, unmistakable knock of justice at his door. The years stretched out like a long, thin wire, pulled taut across the vast landscape of the Volga region. In the quiet laboratories of the Russian Federation, the air was often thick with the hum of cooling fans and the faint, ozone scent of high-powered computers. For nearly a decade, the investigation into the nameless shadow had felt like chasing a ghost through a blizzard. The trail had gone cold, the murders had seemingly stopped, and the public fear had settled into a low, dull ache. But inside those sterile walls, the hunt never truly ceased. Forensic specialists moved with a slow, rhythmic precision, their gloved hands handling tiny glass vials that contained the only remaining pieces of the puzzle. They looked at a discarded scarf, its fabric worn and faded, and a small plastic lighter that had been dropped in the frantic darkness of a crime scene many years prior. These objects were silent, yet they held a microscopic language written in the very blueprint of life. For a long time, the technology of the day could only whisper the truth, but by the time 2020 arrived, the science had finally learned how to scream. The breakthrough did not come with the sudden flash of a Hollywood climax. Instead, it was a mountain of quiet labor, a slow accumulation of data that eventually reached a breaking point. Investigators had embarked on a monumental task, conducting over 10,000 individual genetic examinations. Imagine the sheer scale of that endeavor. 10,000 lives, 10,000 swabs of DNA, each one a thread in a tapestry that spanned across 15 different cities. The scientists worked under the flickering glow of fluorescent lights, their eyes weary as they compared the profile of the killer to a growing database of thousands. They were looking for a match that had eluded them since 2011. Every failed comparison was a heavy sigh, a moment of silence for the 31 women whose lives had been stolen. But the genetic map was becoming clearer. The DNA found on that old scarf and the sweat recovered from the lighter were being analyzed with advanced methods that could trace ancestry and familial links with terrifying accuracy. The shadow was finally gaining a face, a lineage, and a name. In the late months of 2020, the digital tumblers of the investigation finally clicked into place. The genetic profile from the crime scenes was run against a database of past offenders, and a hit appeared on the screen like a sudden spark in a dark room. The name that emerged was Radik Tagirov. He was a 38-year-old man who had been hiding in plain sight within the very city where his reign of terror had first begun. The records showed a history that had previously slipped through the cracks of the massive investigation. He had been convicted of illegal arms trafficking in 2005 and had served time for theft and robbery in 2009. But after 2012, his criminal record seemed to stop. He had vanished from the system, not by leaving the country, but by choosing a life of mundane, quiet domesticity. The investigators stared at his file, realizing that the man they had sought across the entire Volga region was living a life that looked utterly ordinary, tucked away in an apartment in Kazan. By the time the authorities converged on him, Radik Tagirov was no longer a wandering vagrant or a desperate predator on the streets. He was a locksmith by trade. There is a chilling irony in that detail. A man who spent his days repairing the very mechanisms meant to keep the world out, the locks and latches of the city's homes. He had married in 2018, and in the early months of 2020, he had become a father. In his apartment, the air likely smelled of baby powder and home-cooked meals. He would have heard the soft, rhythmic breathing of his newborn son and the gentle movements of his wife in the kitchen. To his neighbors, he was a quiet man, a reliable worker, a husband. He had built a fortress of normalcy around himself, a domestic sanctuary that stood in jarring contrast to the memories of the elderly women who had met their end at his hands. But the genetic breakthrough had pierced through that fortress. The DNA did not care about his new life or his quiet demeanor. It remembered the scarf, the lighter, and the pressure of his hands from a decade ago. On the morning of December 1st, 2020, the winter air in Kazan was biting and sharp. The sun had not yet crested the horizon, leaving the streets bathed in a cold, blue twilight. Snow crunched under the heavy boots of the tactical units as they moved toward Tagirov's building. The silence of the morning was absolute, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind between the high-rise apartments. When the knock finally came, it was the sound of a decade of secrets unraveling. Tagirov was taken into custody without a struggle, his face pale in the harsh glare of the police flashlights. As he was led away, the mundane world he had created began to dissolve. In the interrogation room, the weight of the evidence was laid bare before him. The genetic match was undeniable. The odds of it belonging to anyone else were 1 in trillions. Under the pressure of his own biology, the locksmith finally broke. He began to speak, his voice low and trembling, confessing to a history of violence that had remained hidden behind his front door for 8 long years. The hunt was over, not with a shout, but with the quiet, inevitable closing of a cell door. The air inside the interrogation room in Kazan was thick, heavy with the scent of stale tea and the faint, chemical bite of floor wax. It was early December in the year 2020, and the winter outside was a brutal, unforgiving wall of white. Inside, the world had shrunk to the four walls of a room where the radiator hummed a low, hypnotic tune. Radik Tagirov sat across from the investigators, his posture slumped, his face an unremarkable map of a life lived in shadows. For years, he had been a phantom, a whisper of fear that drifted through the cities of the Volga region. But now, the physical world was catching up to him. The investigators placed the evidence on the table with a soft, deliberate thud. Photographs of shoe prints left in the dust of quiet hallways, and the technical reports of DNA found on a discarded cigarette. The light from the overhead fluorescent bulb flickered slightly, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the table. Tagirov looked at his hands, the hands of a locksmith who understood the intricate, silver secrets of tumblers and pins, and then he began to speak. His voice was a low rasp, a sound like dry autumn leaves skittering across pavement, as he confessed to the lives he had extinguished across 15 different cities. He spoke of the murders as if they were spontaneous occurrences, claiming he killed because he was hungry, because he was a vagrant seeking an easy way to survive. Yet he could not explain the darkness that drove him to return to those apartments time and time again. He told the investigators that he chose his victims by chance, watching them in grocery stores or near the entrances of their humble apartment buildings. He described the way he would offer to help them carry their bags, or how he would pose as a plumber or an electrician, his voice calm and helpful as he stood at their thresholds. The women, many between the ages of 75 and 90, would look into his eyes and see a grandson, a neighbor, a helper. They would turn the tarnished brass keys in their locks and invite the shadow inside. Tagirov's confession was a chilling tapestry of mundane items turned into instruments of finality. He spoke of using whatever was at hand in those quiet, lavender-scented homes: the belt from a soft terracloth bathrobe, the tangled cord of an electric iron, or a simple clothesline taken from a balcony where laundry once fluttered in the river breeze. He claimed he wanted their passing to be quiet, almost as if he were trying to convince himself that his cruelty was a form of mercy. As he spoke, he sometimes wept, the tears tracing slow paths through the stubble on his cheeks, a display of emotion that felt strangely detached from the cold reality of the 31 lives he had taken. The investigators watched him, their pens scratching rhythmically against yellow legal pads, recording the details of a decade of silence finally being broken. The trial began under the heavy, vaulted ceilings of the Supreme Court of Tatarstan in the spring of 2024. The courtroom was a place of polished wood and cold marble, where the air felt thin and charged with the collective grief of hundreds. Families of the victims sat on the hard benches, their fingers interlaced, eyes fixed on the glass enclosure where Tagirov stood. He had recanted his confession by then, claiming the words had been forced from him under the weight of stress, but the evidence was a mountain that could not be moved. The prosecution laid out the details of 31 murders and 34 additional assaults, a ledger of violence that spanned from the year 2011 to 2012. They spoke of the cities that had been haunted by his presence: Ufa, Samara, Perm, and Nizhny Novgorod, cities where the Volga River flows wide and deep, carrying the secrets of the land to the sea. The victims were not just numbers. They were mothers, grandmothers, and keepers of history who had survived wars and hardships only to meet a shadow in their own hallways. The judge's voice was a steady, rhythmic cadence as the sentence was read aloud. For the 31 lives stolen, for the terror sown across the heart of the country, Radik Tagirov was sentenced to life in prison. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was final, a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the years of unsolved mysteries and restless nights. The echo of that gavel eventually faded, leaving behind a silence that was different from the one that had preceded it. It was a silence of closure, though the wounds remained etched into the fabric of the communities along the river. Today, the Volga still flows, its waters gray and silver under the shifting Russian sky. In the cities where the Volga Maniac once walked, the elderly women still gather on benches in the parks, their voices low as they share stories of the past. The Khrushchevka apartment buildings, with their weathered brick and familiar stairwells, stand as silent monuments to the resilience of those who live within them. The locks have been changed, the security cameras hum in the corners, and the memory of the darkness has been pulled into the light of justice. We think of the women of Najda and others whose names were read in that courtroom, and we imagine them finally at peace, their stories no longer defined by the way they ended, but by the lives they lived before the shadow arrived. The locksmith is now behind a door that will never open for him, a door with no key and no handle. The long echo of justice has reached its end, settling into the earth like the first snow of winter, covering the scars of the past in a blanket of quiet, cold reality. The river continues its journey, indifferent to the rise and fall of men, carrying the memory of the lost into the vast, blue distance where the sky meets the water. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.